Okay, welcome to today's panel, which will actually be the last panel of the Middle East program here at QI for 2024. And it is What is the legacy of the Syrian civil war? A conversation between Omar Dahi and Stephen Simon, and I'll be somewhat of a moderator. And if you're not familiar with the Quincy Institute, we're a think tank based in Washington, D.C., that tries to formulate a restraint-oriented foreign policy that moves away from endless wars and military interventions that have not advanced U.S. interests or necessarily been good for the world. Uh, Now, today we are joined by our own Steve Simon, who is a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute and a distinguished fellow and visiting professor at Dartmouth College. Prior to that, he was at MIT. And then from 2011 to 2012, he served on the National Security Council staff as senior director for Middle Eastern and North African Affairs. And that was in the Obama administration. And then he also worked on the Clinton NSC staff from 1994 to 1999 on counterterrorism and Middle East security policy. And his latest book, published last year, is entitled Grand Delusion: The Rise and Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East. We are also joined by Omar Dahi, who is a professor of economics at Hampshire College. And he's also the founding director of Security in Context, a research network on peace, conflict, and international affairs. He's published in various academic journals, and he served as associate editor of the Review of Social Economy, as well as Jadalia, which anyone who follows the Middle East is a avid reader of. He is a founding member of the Beirut School of Critical Security Studies within the Arab Council for Social Sciences. He's served as a lead expert on the United Nations Economic and Social Commission of West Asia's national agenda for the future of Syria, and he was born and raised in Syria before coming to the United States. So I'm going to open this discussion with a question to you, Omar, which is, as someone who grew up in Syria, uh, was born and raised there, uh, and as someone who hasn't been able to return for some time, how have the events of the last 10 days made you feel? What are you feeling as a Syrian right now?
Well, hi, Adam. Hi, Steve. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks to the Quincy Institute for organizing this series. I've been feeling a mixture of different emotions at the personal level. I think a lot of it is kind of somber reflection and taking in the moment, which is obviously momentous and historic in so many ways. Not just because it represents the hopeful end of a 13-year destructive war and um, ongoing and kind of terrible suffering that's happened as a result of it, but also essentially the collapse of a regime that has, been in power my whole lifetime and most of the people's lifetime, and the end of maybe a certain type of post-colonial state that emerged in the Middle East, which kind of the Syrian state represented with the Ba'athist kind of regime in power. So all of those are happening. So there's that kind of taking in the moment of what it represents historically. I think there's a lot of joy. I think there's a lot of symbolism and intentionality in the fact that as um, the regime was collapsing in various cities, there was an immediate way in which, they headed to the prisons and, opened the doors for prisoners like Sednaya prison and so on. It's brought tremendous joy, obviously, for them and their families and for people who can actually go back to Syria after being incredibly, kind of displaced once, twice, three times over in various places. There's a lot of trepidation, I think. I mean, I think we've seen that this war and the collapse of the regime and the end of the war brought a lot of joy to people. But I think it also came at tremendous costs. The costs to Syrian people in terms of death and destruction, but it's also, in my view, come at a loss of sovereignty in various ways, which has happened over the past decade or so, gradually, and now is in many ways something that needs to be thought through and rebuilt in various ways. But the manner in which the regime fell provided a certain space. So the fact that there was a lot of bloodshed these past 13 years, but that the final collapse in the last 2 weeks happened quite quickly and relatively bloodlessly, coupled with some positive signaling from the de facto government in power about preserving state institutions, not, you know, uh, kind of condoning or supporting or kind of calling for mass retribution and trying to establish some semblance of law and order. There's a lot of other negative signals, which maybe we can kind of talk about, and things that are happening. It's complicated. It's a fast-moving situation. So it's a mixture of all of those things.
Yeah, of course, the HTS and other militias were able to take over Aleppo without much fighting, which I think was a devastating blow to the morale of the regime. There was some fighting in Hama. I think regime forces ambushed the opposition, killed something like 300 of them, but and there was almost no fighting in Damascus. You did mention something that I want to follow up with you very quickly on. You talked about the Ba'athist regime as a sort of post-colonial order in Syria. Do you have any concerns, though, that there's going to be a new sort of neo-Ottoman order, perhaps, and that these regional countries, such as Israel and perhaps Turkey, are already violating the sovereignty of Syria? I mean, we've seen an escalation in Israeli strikes on various military facilities in Syria, and certainly the Turks seem to want to have influence in Damascus. Or does that concern you?
Yeah, I mean, so I think yeah, you went right to the heart of some of these questions, which is good. And I think I would distinguish between the two if I was to step back, because I think at this point, what I've been trying to think through is what does it mean to think about the basic elements of a Syrian national interest at this point, right? What is the frame of reference for concern about any of those? Has to be measured against what we might try to think of as the basic elements of this Syrian national interest, while taking into account that Syria is weak, while taking into account that it's already been kind of exposed to all sorts of foreign influence and the actual material presence of foreign powers. But what would it be, and what would it be to kind of work towards the aspiration that I think prompted a lot of this, which is prompted a lot of this, meaning the uprising, the revolution in Syria that kind of devolved into a civil war, and working towards what we would hope is a strong, unified, and democratic Syrian state. If we take that as the aspiration, and if we take kind of a national interest as the baseline, I think the first step is territorial integrity and preventing the fragmentation of Syria, specifically the political fragmentation of Syria. Here I see Israel as a threat because at the moment, and also historically, U.S. and Western views towards the Middle East were also largely framed through Israeli interests, and I worry now what that might be. We've seen Israel kind of further invading Syrian territory into kind of the demilitarized zone, the destruction of the Syrian military. So I worry about that. I worry about that kind of territorial fragmentation and the calls for that we're seeing now and again. I don't think it's particularly serious at this point, but kind of worries about kind of sectarianism and the status of minorities. I think Turkish influence is slightly different. I think Turkish influence doesn't necessarily have an interest in the territorial fragmentation, and that it's going to be something that's going to be wrestled with for a significant amount of time. What I worry most about Turkish influence at this point at the immediate level is the potential of a war in the, expansion of a war in the north east of the country between Turkey and Syrian Democratic Forces. I know Quincy had a kind of a discussion about this a few days ago, which I missed, but I think there has to be some sort of compromise there, which we can talk about maybe what some of those elements are. But I think obviously Iran and the Iranian axis is a net loser from what happened, and Turkey is a net winner. And what extent that will actually, how that'll play out in the long run, it's still not clear. But I think at least in the very short and medium run, Turkey is definitely going to be significantly influential. But I think there's going to be a lot of pushback against this, and I worry also about the pushback against it happening at the expense of a kind of a meaningful political, at least peaceful political transition for the time being.
Only because you talked about a peaceful political transition, I'm going to ask you one more follow-up, which I know I've really put you on the spot here without even going to Stephen yet. But we've seen HTS sort of say all the right things. People from outside Syria keep talking about an inclusive government. In some sense, there's an inclusive government in that they're appointing other armed Islamist groups to positions of power. They appointed Ahrar al-Sham members to I think governorships in part of Damascus and Tartus and other places. Um, but they don't seem to be using the word democracy. And so I guess I'm going to ask an almost Orientalist question, and I hate to ask it, but only because so many people are going to be saying this or asking this, and they're going to ask it out loud, which is Syria capable of democracy? I mean, is that something that people should be pushing for? Or should they just accept a peaceful transition, even if it's not democratic? And can a peaceful transition that's not democratic hold?
Uh, well, I mean, I think there are various aspects to that of what, in terms of how do we think about this transition. And at this point, aspiring towards a country that can be called democratic or that can have actually democratic institutions where kind of people can have political, you know, open and free political deliberation and some sort of collective representation, basic regard for civil and political rights. I think, when we take a step back and think about the status that Hayat Tahrir Sham finds itself in, it's negotiating with multiple stakeholders at the same time, right? It has different audiences. So on the one hand, it has the audience of the international kind of community that it wants to basically present itself as not a threat internationally, not, it wants to be taken off the terror list. It has to negotiate with other forces, regionally. I mean, I think it's at some point the UAE and Saudi Arabia who were kind of in various ways increasing their ties with the Syrian government before its fall, are basically calling for and trying to influence the transition in ways that they see will curb perhaps the influence of Turkey over the future. I don't know the extent of those discussions or have any special information, but just kind of reading the signals and the meeting that took place in Jordan about, the flashpoint has become UN 2254. But I think what we need to think about is what do we call the elements of democracy? Rather than thinking about democracy with a big D, what are the kind of democratic aspects of the future Syria that we want to see? And I think it has to start with a kind of a non-sectarian transition, a transition that's based on equal citizenship, guaranteeing the minimal of political and civil rights. In the case of, for example, the Kurdish population, cultural rights as well, and perhaps respecting the kind of administrative and even somewhat the political autonomy that's been achieved, but without an extreme political decentralization that I think can create further conflict. So, I mean, yes, as a Syrian, yes, Syria is capable of democracy, and I think it's hard to say left to its own devices given how penetrated it is by foreign powers. But I think we have to aspire to that, and I think the problem now is Syria not turning into an open field of foreign kind of influence, where kind of, what was not settled through the war is now going to be settled through the peace somehow, not necessarily along the same axes of, kind of Iran versus the other countries, which I think that's a different moment. But there's also a significant and large civil society in Syria that has been empowered as a result of the conflict. There was demonstration even today in Damascus, actually. I think maybe might be still going on as we speak, kind of calling out HTS for being authoritarian, calling out their what they see as appointments that don't have necessarily legitimacy, but also calling for what they're calling a civil state. They're not calling it a secular state, but a civil state, meaning a state that kind of tries to separate religion from kind of political life. So it's an aspiration. There are lots of forces that might be calling for the kind of state that I kind of mentioned, a democratic, non-secular state. They're relatively weak. Many of them are outside. I mean, a lot of that civil society is not in the country right now, and that's a big problem because I think the weight of gravity has to return to inside Syria for that political deliberation to happen.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, of course, Jolani said that he wants to have a state built on institutions, not built on one man. But there is the reality that, at least right now, he is the one man who matters in terms of final decision-making authority. I'm going to pass it to you, Stephen. Of course, you're not Syrian, but Syria has been a part of your professional life for decades. What does the fall of the Assad regime mean for the US? What does it mean for the region?
Two very different things, and I'll be eager to hear what Omar, has to say about this, because he's a keen observer of the international dimension as well as he's already indicated. Um, the United States really never had a terribly strong interest in Syria or Syrian affairs. I mean, until relatively recently. Um, there was a brief flirtation or an attempt at a flirtation by the first post-colonial government, which actually reached out to the United States in the hope that the U.S. would take on the training of the new National Syrian Army. But the U.S. demurred, and because it had other concerns, primarily in Europe, and didn't really want to get involved. And there was a stab at covert action in the late 1950s, U.S. covert action in Syria, aimed at a presumed communist threat. But at the end of the day, the U.S. backed off and really didn't follow through. I think mostly because of a mature sense of its own ignorance about Syria and inability to judge the reliability of the various players that it was interacting with. So there wasn't much, and then once Syria entered the Soviet orbit, it was really very much outside of America's orbit, and the U.S. backed Israel in its rivalry with Syria, a rivalry that exploded a number of times in an armed conflict. But the United States really never developed affinity groups in Syria. Never really knew Syria that well. Never knew Syrians, for that matter. Whereas you look at the Soviet Union, and they had thousands of people deployed to Syria, and they intermarried with Syrian women. They had mixed families. There was a very, very close relationship there. Maybe somewhat similar even to the kind of relationship that the United States has with Israel, although the United States doesn't generally deploy more than penny packets of U.S. personnel to Israel. So when you say, well, does it matter, to the United States? I think, until recently, the answer would have been no. And, the U.S. did get deeply involved in Syria during the Syrian civil war, but not in a way that, was aimed at building durable relations. It was basically in the form of an arms transfer program that didn't work out all that well, from an American perspective. I think at that time, because I think it triggered, the Russian intervention in the Civil War in 2015, the direct Russian intervention in 2015. So, even there, an intensive U.S. involvement, well, it was under the table, and it was not capable of building the kinds of relationships that might have endured in a post-Civil War period. And then after the war, U.S. interest was basically wrapped up in this sort of punish Bashar Assad mode, which, as Quincy has maintained, for a while was counterproductive in the sense that it punished, Syrian people rather than the regime. So I'm not sure at this point what what kind of a stake the United States has in the outcome in Syria, except in a derivative sense. In other words, um, how can developments within Syria affect other U.S. interests outside of Syria? And that's a question I think the administration is grappling with for for good for good reasons.
Is there a metaphor there in that we had this haphazard training program for anti-Assad militias, and it didn't really work out, and it was disbanded the same year that it was started, and that was run by General Nagata at the time. And then we had these arms transfers, and we had some covert action, and then of course the support for the SDF in northeastern Syria, and we were just involved enough to elicit a reaction from the Russians, as you pointed out, but not so involved that we developed any meaningful relationships or an ability to shape conditions on the ground. Would it have been better if we had just kept a hands-off policy rather than dipping our toes into the Syrian civil war, so to speak?
Yeah, I'm generally a fan of counterfactuals, maybe because I'm a bit of a fantasist. So I don't, but I don't really know the answer to that question. I mean, I'd have thought it better just to stay out. I think, by 2013, when this program, according to news reports, really uh, took wing. They, the Syrians the Syrian regime had used chemical weapons against its own people around Damascus in a fairly serious attack. And I think that created internal and to some extent external pressures on the Obama regime on the Obama government to, you know, distant to reduce the distance that Obama had imposed between the U.S. and the Syrian conflict and do something. And once in Washington, well, you have to do something, uh, you know, mode gets a grip on the policy process, well, then, something will be done. And in this case, it was not the sort of program in which the United States had openly wrapped up its prestige in. There was, but because of the way it was carried out, which was under the table, pretty much, the U.S. could, even while it was acting, distance itself from what it was doing. I mean, we know from sort of the political science studies of these kinds of programs that they tend to create feeding frenzies within civil wars for control of the arms that are flowing in. And that's not good because it increases the level of violence. And the parties in the conflict that dominate that feeding frenzy and grab most of the arms might not be the ones that you wanted to arm to begin with. So, once you begin this, really from the minute you start it, you're already losing control over it. And that's not great. And the increase in the level of violence really isn't great for the, ordinary people of Syria either. In any case, the Trump administration shut this program down in 2017 because it wasn't really producing the kinds of results that at least the Trump administration wanted to see in Syria, whatever they were. And that was it, for the U.S. the U.S. involvement. The U.S. had an envoy to the armed opposition, of course, a series of talented diplomats, who interacted fairly vigorously, I think, with the opposition. But it wasn't so much with the armed opposition, but really with the external, political opposition, which, as Omar has pointed out, tends to lose its juice, during the war, where the real juice, flows, through those who are actually on the ground and fighting the regime.
Yeah, and of course, Jolani, I don't think would have been Washington's choice as and HTS as the people who overthrew the regime, and he is designated individually, and the group is also designated as a foreign terrorist organization. Now, there's been a bounty on his head. He was operating openly in Idlib. I suspect if the U.S. wanted him dead, he'd already be dead. But it doesn't change the reality that he's not exactly what the U.S. envisioned as part of the so-called moderate opposition. But Omar, what do you think is the legacy of U.S. intervention in Syria? It was very different from U.S. intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan, and yet it was an intervention in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mentioned in my opening kind of response to your question that I've lived my whole life under the Assad regime. I've also lived my whole life under some form of U.S. sanctions on Syria. So I was born in 1978. The earliest U.S. kind of official sanctions were in 1979, but they really ramped up in the kind of 2003 and then significantly in 2011 and after. But what it also meant was, as Stephen mentioned, that Syria was outside of the U.S. military security orbit. So it may not have, had many ties with it, but there were occasions in which kind of pragmatic, transactional kind of exchanges happened between the U.S. and Syria, and kind of Syria was seen among the resistance axis as more pragmatic in various ways, especially under Hafiz al-Assad. But I think that's important to kind of think about in light of the U.S. actions, because U.S. actions are not only by commission, also by omission. So, I mean, I kind of, Quincy's, goal, as you mentioned, is kind of restrained. And I think when you have a reputation of not being restrained, you also give out signals to the different actors. And I think as the uprisings unfolded, it's both what Syria did, what the U.S. did in Syria, but also what they did elsewhere. So, for example, the invasion of Libya sent out signals to a lot of Syrian political oppositional actors that with enough violence inside the country, the U.S. could be dragged into a confrontation. So that sent out a kind of a maximalist political signal, and it trenched all the actors involved. I mean, the Syrian government ultimately, as I've always said, bears the responsibility because it had the ability to lead a process of change potentially. And also it had the ability, for the last few years, but it didn't. But the combination of sanctions, the combination of the kind of actions that Stephen mentioned, is not just in their actual impact, but also in the kind of signals that they sent throughout the Syrian civil war. And I think the net effect, I would say, is that it fueled and prolonged the civil war in ways that it would not have had. And again, I, also don't know counterfactuals, but I think it's fair to say that, one of the things that the U.S. kind of, I think initially had an instinct to stay out of the Syrian conflict, but it got pushed closer and closer into it in ways that I think exacerbated negative trends and dynamics. The sanctions itself kind of exacerbated the war economy in addition to the suffering. And, we've had kind of lots of studies and kind of thinking about kind of the destructive impact of the kind of territorial and other fragmentation over the years. So, thinking about U.S. legacy, it's kind of also thinking about U.S. policy generally towards the Middle East and kind of how that was viewed at the onset of the uprising, which I think also contributed in addition to the kind of direct effects.
Do you
Yeah,
think that?
if I could jump in, Omar, I just wanted to underscore, some of the things you've said. I think the Obama administration, um, oh, I mean, there's this interesting, sort of, failure to synchronize in terms of U.S. perceptions and Syrian perceptions at that time, because the Libya intervention was, and the results of the Libya intervention were among those factors that caused the Obama administration to distance itself from the situation in Syria, because they viewed the results of the intervention in Libya as being, so dour, um, and unanticipated and undesired, that there wasn't, therefore, an interest in getting involved uh, in Syria. The other thing was that, the administration, I think, understood uh, the um, the danger that lay in Syrian opposition expectations of U.S. intervention. And therefore, when Obama gave his really first big, speech on this, in the context of an Arab Spring set of remarks, he said, well, there ought to be a transition in Syria, and Assad is obviously an obstacle to that transition, and so he probably has to go. He needs to go. But then Obama. Said quite starkly, I thought, really bluntly, that as much as that may be true, it's not the United States that's going to overthrow Assad. That's not going to happen. It's up to the Syrian people themselves, to do it. And it's interesting how, signaling can fail, in IR, in international relations generally, but in this case, the signaling effort was really a dismal failure, because on the Syrian opposition side, that second paragraph to Obama's speech was really unheard, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think to just go off of that as well, I mean, given the fact that Syria was relatively unknown to most people, even kind of just generally, and after 2011 became kind of overknown or overdetermined, and there's so many narratives about U.S. involvement, and I think um, how to separate kind of aspirations from the actual reality, from the signaling is difficult, and I think you can twist yourself in knots trying to sort all these threads together. But I think that's why kind of you have to think about it in light of the kind of the big kind of picture of U.S. actions in general, what people's expectations, what the signaling is. I mean, I think there was a lot of sense that there's a sliding scale of U.S. intervention that starts with sanctions and end with armed invasion. Um, Not necessarily that it was ever on the minds of the U.S. administration, but I think also the fact that you had countries that are more friendly to the U.S. in the region, the Gulf countries and Turkey. Turkey's a NATO member. All of that kind of inducing a climate of regime change, and that needs to be essentially the task moving forward, also raised people's expectations in various ways. And I think the U.S. would have had to also not just not intervene directly, but curb the policies of those countries as well, which I think is difficult to imagine as well in terms of actually, what the U.S. was even interested in doing. So there's both elements to that, both the U.S. actions and kind of directly and indirectly, but also the actions of the Gulf, the actions of Turkey. And that was why kind of the conflict became so complicated. There were so many actors with veto power, in a way over a political transition that it kind of the best outcome at some point was just to freeze the conflict and stop the kind of further deterioration.
Um, yeah, that's an interesting point. now you see that the world's attention is really on Syria. And it's sort of on Syria because of the media frenzy that has occurred. And it hadn't been on Syria for several years, which I think uh, granted, the conflict had stagnated somewhat, and there were these different groups with territorial control over a partitioned country. You had the Turks and HTS up in Idlib, and you had SDF in northeastern Syria with U.S. advisors, and then you had the regime controlling some parts of Syria, along with its backers in Moscow and Tehran and Hezbollah for that matter. Um, and it was sort of out of sight, out of mind for at least I'd say well, maybe even longer, maybe the last 7 years or so. Um, and now all of a sudden there's international attention in Syria. But of course, we know how that's going to go. Christmas is going to happen, and then President Trump is going to take office, and all of a sudden Syria is going to be forgotten, and the general international public won't be paying attention anymore. Is that a good thing or a bad thing, Omar?
Um, I mean, overall, I think for Syrians who are interested in not having Hayat Tahrir al-Sham dominate the next period, they think it's a good thing because they think that some sort of international attention will ensure that no one party can have a kind of an exclusionary grip on power. I don't think Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is going to be able to rule Syria. I think they don't have the capacity administratively or politically. They're too weak. They might have aspirations, but it's just not going to happen. They're not going to be able to. They're going to have to negotiate with um, lots of different groups in the country. What kind of negotiations will take place? Who are going to be kind of influencing them? What directions they'll be being pushed? All of those are already probably happening and will continue to happen for the time being. They've set themselves a March 1st deadline. So in general, I mean, the coverage is not something you can do much about, but I think part of the worry is what's happening behind the scenes that is not getting the coverage really, and what should the coverage actually we be focusing on at this point. But I think that you know the worry is what's going to happen in the next months, March 1st and after March 1st, when presumably there'll be less kind of that discovering one, again, another prison or kind of staging dubious interviews like CNN did, which it really does a lot of damage in all sorts of ways. So I think, whatever we can instrumentalize the coverage to actually pay attention to what are the national priorities at this point in terms of economic revival, in terms of food security, whatever we can direct to kind of attention to the plight of the refugees and the question of whether we're going to be able to, or Syria is going to have the state capacity to manage the millions of refugees, many of whom want to go back, some of whom are wary of going back. I mean, there's going to be lots and lots of priorities which we can talk about, and I think those are going to be the ones that we have to focus on. There's also going to be the question of, how and in what sense is there going to be an international legitimacy to whatever government comes out of this, and will that uh, form of international legitimacy lead to a lifting of the sanctions and perhaps some sort of donor conference for Syria. So all of those are kind of the questions on our mind, but the media tends to kind of follow probably the most short-termist, sensationalist type of news, and that's probably going to fade away.
Omar, can I jump in and take advantage of the fact that you are the person who probably knows the most about the current political economy of Syria, the challenges it's facing um, in that domain, some of which you just alluded to, very briefly. You just kind of snapped them off. Uh, especially administrative capacity, ability to extend the writ of the state, and to feed not only those who are displaced internally or maybe still in their homes, but those who might possibly return, at some point to Syria from other places they've gone to. And so my question to you would be, okay, so you're addressing, let's say, a contact group of concerned states, and they ask you, so what should we do? And and in order of priority. And I remember going through these kinds of discussions with respect to Iraq, after the U.S. invasion, and and all that. Um, I don't know how productive those were, but the thing is, you're actually in a position, especially by virtue of the work that you've done for ECOWAS, at the UN, um, to offer valuable advice on this. So I was wondering what would be on your mind if you were asked.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also a lot of it is not a mystery, for a lot of people following the Syrian economy. I mean, I think at the basic level, after 13 years, you have the overwhelming majority of people in deep poverty, and access to basic goods and services is an issue. So there has to be a way in which basic goods and services that we're talking about, kind of just education, basic healthcare availability, just food security at a level that's across the country. Those need to be kind of paid attention to, especially as some of those were being secured from Russia or Iran. And the question is Russia and Iran going to be willing and kind of allowed to continue kind of the new government going to decide? So we have the basic, food, goods, and services. The other big issue is electric power generation, kind of restoring the capacity to actually fuel, and have electricity available, but also kind of fuel Syrian industry, or some sort of revival of agriculture, and also kind of medium and small level enterprises. And I think by all indications, Syria does have that capacity in terms of at least natural gas powered plants. The question is money, and the question is, actually being able to reestablish control. Some of those, for example, natural gas had a lot of Russian kind of involvement. To what extent that's going to continue seems unlikely, and I think that there's going to be a question there of kind of using that for electric power generation. There's a widespread, among all experts that I know, that Syria does have within a few months the ability to actually power up two-thirds of the needs for kind of electric power generation. But I think that requires technical expertise, and that requires money. There's a question of allocation of oil revenues in the in the northwest of Syria, right? Is that oil just for the northeast? Is it for all of Syria, right? We need to kind of think about what is the outcome of those negotiations, which I hope will be negotiations actually among the Syrian government, among Syrian Democratic Forces, for some sort of compromise that allows that kind of, redistribution of resources. And I think there's then the question of administrative capacity throughout the country. I think there's a lot of technical expertise, a lot of existing kind of public sector officials that many of them stayed in Syria, many of them are outside of Syria. And I think looking for that technical expertise and bringing it back and empowering it is something that we need to kind of think about at this point, because there's going to be, and we're already seeing some signs. So I mentioned some positive signs, but there are also some negative signs of kind of arbitrary appointments. We'll see if that's a trend that'll continue. But finally, I'd say there's overwhelming attention right now to the cities and neglect of what's happening in the countryside. And I think that's a problem. I think we don't want to replicate the kind of old model where everything happens in the city and everyone's attention in the city, and you neglect what's what's happening elsewhere. And I'm talking about both economic needs, but also the security situation, the kind of potential lawlessness or spice, kind of downward spiral rule of law, which can kind of exacerbate existing fault lines, create new ones. I'm not just talking about kind of in the east of Syria, but even in the coastal areas and also, all around the country. I think we need to really pay attention to kind of periphery dynamics, and think about what are the needs there.
Steven, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask a question back at you, similar to what you asked Omar. If you had to advise the either the Biden or the incoming Trump administration on what to do about sanctions on Syria and on HTS, what would you advise?
Uh, well, there are political constraints, I think, even on a Trump administration, regarding the sanctions relief. But I'd say certainly, taking as a model the U.S. response to the earthquake in Syria a number of years ago, that the administration, the incoming administration, or even the Biden administration right now, if it chose to do so, could simply suspend the enforcement of sanctions. You know, in the case of the earthquake, it was a 6-month waiver, basically, of sanctions enforcement, which worked quite well, and it helped Syria recover from the damage that it had incurred in that natural disaster. So I would say, look, taking into consideration the political constraints, I'd say to to um, uh, to the administration, look, everybody's got their reservations about HTS and its coalition partners. Everybody's concerned about this. Everybody is aware of the roots of HTS, and that gives people, um, a kind of makes them nervous. But let's talk about a grace period of 6 months or perhaps more, where sanctions are waived. There's a general license issued by the Department of the Treasury in the United States, for the transfer of goods and services and trade and so forth to Syria, and that would, among other things, enable deep-pocketed countries with an interest in what's happening in Syria, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE on the one hand and Turkey on the other, um, to invest in the development of critical infrastructure, including, and most especially, as Omar pointed out, um, uh, energy production and transmission, and not just to urban areas, but to the countryside as well. So I think that would be key. Now, to some extent, there will be competition, in Syria, I think, between Turkey and Qatar on the one hand, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE on the other. Um, and that competition, that rivalry, might actually benefit, the new dispensation in Syria, the new regime in Syria. The other linked issue here is the disposition of oil resources, which are now under control of the United States by virtue of the U.S. military deployment in Syria, the revenues of which accrue to the Kurds, to the SDF, rather than nationally. Well, I think the United States will, if it's interested in the stabilization of Syria, will have to think hard about, the flow of resources from Syria's oil deposits, and those oil deposits, by the way, will themselves need substantial investment, because that kind of infrastructure degrades, really very rapidly, much much quicker than you might think. And right now, those fields are producing something like, I don't know, 32,000 barrels a day. I mean, it's quite a bit less than, say, in 2008 when they were producing something like 400,000 barrels a day. So you really need to get in there and improve the production of those oil fields, and secondly, um, get that revenue to the state so that it could proceed to first extend its writ. Because as Omar noted, there's going to be a real problem with order in this place. New York City has like 8 million people, and it's got a very tiny area, something like 300 square miles, maybe 320 square miles. But New York City has 34,000 people in its police force. And then you look at HTS, and well, maybe they deployed, maybe they mustered 10,000 troops, to enter Aleppo, Damascus, Homs, and now Latakia. But you know, that's that ain't enough to run that whole country, to demonstrate the face of the state throughout Syrian territory. And what we know from so many, examples, most famously, the emergence of the mafia in Sicily, because, the Italian state in the north couldn't exert its authority, in the south. You parallel governments emerge, and they can be very hard to dislodge, either through co-optation or liquidation. So, the sooner there's a central authority in Baghdad that not only can manifest itself, physically throughout the country, but also be a conduit for the distribution of resources. The sooner that happens, the sooner the sooner Syria will have a chance at the kind of cohesion and unity that Omar was saying earlier in our conversation was going to be very important to its success.
Um, I found it the slip up about Iraq is interesting because we have been talking about this, of course, for 20 years now, about extending the writ of the state in these post-conflict countries, and many of the same problems exist. In fact, uh, even the issue about oil. I mean, the KRG and federal Iraq are engaged in that same dispute, and it might offer some sort of example of things to come. But I do have a follow-up for you, Stephen, about that's actually a question from the chat that I think you're the best person to answer this one, which is somebody asks, might the overthrow of the Assad regime present an opportunity for Syria and Israel to engage in some kind of new understanding or peace negotiations? Of course, Jolani's chosen name has to do with his roots in the Golan Heights. And Israel has conducted all kinds of strikes in Syria in the last several days, tr basically dismantling the entire Syrian conventional military force and ensuring that all they have is small arms going forward. But do you think there's an opportunity, or is that pie in the sky?
I think it's pie in the sky. I mean, uh, as I understand Israeli policy regarding Syria, um, well, it's a little bit difficult, to parse, because I think the Israelis have conflicting or ambivalent, attitudes about what they think an ideal Syrian neighbor would be. I mean, there is a long-term impulse, I think, which you can see playing out right now, where the Israelis believe the best Syria to have as a neighbor is one that is weak and divided. Um, and the logic of that, I suppose, from an Israeli perspective is self-evident. So the Israelis will be saying to the Americans, "Oh, stay in Syria, continue to back the SDF, carve off a big piece of Syria that's not available to the regime, and while the Israelis themselves carry out these attacks and improve their own position on the ground on the other side of the old demilitarized zone, stemming from 1967 and that war, and then the 73 war. So you could see that. On the other hand, Israelis, I think always valued certainly Hafiz al-Assad, the father of the current or recently departed leader, because he did run a strong state, which is the opposite of a weak and divided one. And that strong state meant that if he did make a commitment, he could deliver on it. For example, the disengagement agreements following the 1973 war. Um, I don't think there was ever any doubt in Israeli minds that if Assad signed that piece of paper, that Syria was going to stick to that. And that only happens, of course, if there's a strong state. So I think the Israelis are probably looking at this situation and for the moment thinking, it's got to be weak and divided. If Israeli interests are gonna work out here, maybe that other dimension of Israeli thinking will begin to make itself felt, over time. Although the more the Israelis do what it is they're doing to maintain a weak and divided Syria, the less likely it is that a strong state will emerge. On the Syrian side, how can this possibly be a priority, for Sharar right now? I don't see it. He's got other fish to fry. My big concern on the question of Israel and Syria is what the posture of Turkey will be, because the Turks have embraced a very kind of hostile and aggressive tone towards Israel, largely owing to the Gaza war, um, and differences over that. So, and Erdogan told the UN General Assembly that he thinks that the UN should authorize force against Israel. Well, it might be that the Turks, have a deal, or could strike a deal with the HTS or whoever is running, Syria in that broad coalition to say, well, listen, we think it's really important to move Turkish forces, closer to the Israeli-Syrian border. And if that were to happen, then I think the integrity of the Syrian state is in jeopardy, because the risk of conflict between Israel and Turkey, which would be a disaster for the United States, complete disaster, um, would become, at least, conceivable, or a, conceivable danger.
Omar, I'm going to give you the last word. We have a couple minutes left. At the beginning of this conversation, you talked about thinking about democracy, not with the big D, but, basically, if I can paraphrase it, what are the characteristics of democracy? And you expressed some hope about the potential for Syrian society to be inclusive and at least have democratic elements. Some people have drawn an analogy or Taliban Afghanistan and Syria. Of course, I think that's very overly simplistic. Although the media has asked Jolani about that, and Jolani has basically said, well, Syria is a different state, and of course, anyone who even has a rudimentary reading of Afghanistan and Syria knows that. But what are the characteristics of Syria and Syrian people that gives you hope? I know it's an educated country. I know it has a history of plurality and communal harmony in some ways. But I don't want to answer the question for you. As a Syrian, what gives you hope within Syrian society that Syrians can capitalize on this moment and improve things?
Yeah, I mean, all the things you mentioned, but also I think, I mean, my hope is that the fault lines of the war will change. I mean, there was a binary over the past 13 years of opposition and loyalists, right? But I think objectively, a lot of the people who are among the government side, or who threw their loyalties with the government, not because they necessarily loved Assad, but because they feared the alternative. And in many ways, they had a material reason to fear the alternative. Um, have objectively similar outlooks on perhaps the shape of this, what a post-Assad might look. Not all of them, but many of them, with the opposition. So you have a secular, middle class oriented, secular here is kind of to degrees, but a kind of professional, civic-minded middle class that does not want to see a religious state. You have also a significant number of kind of religious minority populations. You have the Kurdish, Arab kind of nationalities as well. I mean, I think all of that on the one hand. On the other hand, discursively at the level of even speech, which I think is important, the new government has also sent that it doesn't seek to create that kind of state. And I think that's important because discursive signs are, not just because they portray intentions, but they kind of seek to curb the other actors who might be taking advantage of this. We know how when a leader can kind of mobilize certain groups to various causes or another, they can kind of, say all sorts of things that are not necessarily, direct policy, but which later on can become policy. So all of those factors give me hope. The fact that, the field is open now in Syria for people to return and to work. I'm hoping to go back soon after thinking that I might maybe potentially never be able to go back, is a good thing. So we have to have that optimism of the intellect, or optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect.
I think that's a great phrasing and a great way to end the panel. And I hope you're right, and I hope you get to return to Syria for a visit soon. With that, I'm going to thank everyone who's joined today, including those who have stayed a little bit extra. Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Stephen. Omar, do you have any projects you're working on that you want to share before we end this?
I think people should invite you to check out securityincontext.org, which is the kind of research network that I kind of work with, and kind of check out our own content and give us feedback.
Okay, thanks for that. And for those who asked questions in the chat about Turkey and Northeast Syria, Stephen and I were also on a panel earlier this week called Power Plays U.S.-Turkey Relations Under Trump. It's on the Quincy Institute website under events. You can also find it on if you just search Quincy Institute in YouTube, you'll find a recording there. And we go very in depth into those topics. That's why I didn't ask those questions on this panel. But thank you both, and thanks to everyone who's joined, and we'll see you all in the new year.